Hello everyone, my name is Stuart and here we are again to build another blaster. This is going to be another assembly guide tutorial video. Not only is it just a build guide video, but it's also a video where I'm going to try and share my thoughts and opinions about the blaster and what kind of recommendations I have for its use and what you might want to get. But here in front of us we have the Bulwark by JackRabbitNerfer. The Bulwark is a really cool blaster, really unique. And I say that about a lot of blasters, and a lot of them are, factually. But this one's really cool because the magazine feeds from the top like the real firearm, the P90. So unique setup for sure. This Bulwark, this one in particular, is a single stage motor setup, meaning that only 2 flywheels are spinning. You can get a dual stage setup, which gives it 4 flywheels and more power, especially over fully automatic sustained fire. About that, these Bulwarks are fully automatic. There's a rev-trigger and a fire trigger. It's a really nice combo for sure. However, given that it is twice the triggers, it is also kind of twice the wiring. So if you're familiar with some HPA designs, such as the Magpie or the Pigeon, or etc., you'll know that those are pretty simple to solder and wire up. This one does get a bit more difficult. The Bulwark isn't the hardest blaster to build, but it definitely isn't the easiest. The toughest part is probably the soldering, but if you follow along, you're going to do just fine. Aside from the soldering, really just most of this blaster is just bolting it together, just throwing the screws in there and getting it all tightened down. So really great blaster. Props to the designer. Really cool. Some serious style points. I've said that before too. But some things to keep in mind though. A little bit about me. I've been working here at Frontline Foam for coming on 2 years soon. And with those 2 years, I have a pretty significant amount of experience assembling these 3D printed blasters. Now the Bulwark is a bit new to Frontline Foam. I haven't built as many Bulwarks as I have other blasters, but I've still built a solid handful of Bulwarks by now. And I'm hoping that the advice that I can give through my experience with Bulwarks can help you in your build of the Bulwark. What you see in front of you is all of the hardware and all of the printed parts that you need to build a Bulwark start to finish. If you have your own 3D printer and you want to print your own parts, you can order the hardware from us in a little box and it'll come to you and then you can follow along. Or if you want to still do it yourself and you don't have a 3D printer, you can get the parts, all of the parts from us in a box and follow along that way. At the end of this video, there are going to be a couple things that I'll mention as for upgrades or customizations that I recommend. For the Bulwark, currently there aren't too many, but I'm sure more will be coming down the road. And I'll talk about some of those and my take on those things. The chronology for how we're going to go about this, we're going to start with the handle here and do some soldering, and then proceed to slowly wire up towards the motors and slowly assemble it as we go in that direction, and then work our way backwards from there. So it might seem a little bit disorganized at times, but bear with me and just do your best to follow along. One last thing, guys, to mention before we dive into the build here, and something to keep in mind, is that our prints, if you printed your own parts off of the files from Thingiverse, there's a chance that your parts are going to look ever so slightly different than ours. What we do here at Frontline Foam, when we have a new blaster that we're producing, we sometimes make small modifications to the files, and generally the purpose of these modifications isn't to change the blaster drastically or anything like that. Really what we do is little simple changes that help make the assembly process easier. So you'll see some differences here, like this groove is something that we modified, and it simply allows us to feed wires through the blaster a little easier. Another design that we're going to be modifying soon is this hole here. We're going to make it a little wider so there's more room for the wires. They're just little changes here and there, little tweaks that help things just come together easier. If you have the original files from the designer, that's not a big deal. You'll still be able to follow along for sure. And if you want the files that we use, soon you'll be able to find those on the Frontline Foam website and get them, no problem there. So with that, let's get started here. What we're looking at is the handle right here. To start, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my 2 triggers and put them in their slots. You can tell that was pretty tight. And oh geez, it's stuck. Need to make these triggers move. They're obviously not supposed to sit there solid in their grooves. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this little file, and I'm going to touch up on the areas of the print here, here, and here to help clean up the channels and make sure that the trigger can move freely in there. What I also might end up doing is stepping over to our belt sander and taking a little bit off of the edges of this trigger. It's something that I've commonly had to do. This is another one of those optimizations that we may change. We may shrink the trigger ever so slightly in our file set. So I'm going to get started on all the filing. The goal is to let the triggers slide back and forth easily. So let's do that. All right, so here we are. I took this to the belt sander and just basically flattened the surface a little more, took it back. And I also took a blade here and just shaved off the kind of just the top layer of the overhang there from the print. And now I can move the trigger back and forth. It's not butter smooth, but I think that'll be good enough. We'll test it later and we'll correct it if we need to. And now let's do the same for the bottom trigger. All right, so this trigger's looking good. We can wiggle it back and forth pretty easily. I had to file down this surface here, as well as just touch up the edges of this trigger, remove the elephant's foot from the print bed. So that's looking good. And the top one is looking good. What's gonna happen with these triggers is these are gonna press directly onto the button on these micro switches. So they need to be able to move smoothly enough so that way the spring alone from the button can return them to their original position. So I'm holding this switch in place, and when I push this trigger down on the button, it is able to push the trigger back and re-engage, or disengage, I guess. And we'll try the same thing for the top. Yeah, that's not looking so good. I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit more filing on this trigger so that way it fits a little bit smoother up here. And there we go, a little bit more filing and the trigger returns to its position properly. So looking good there. You may notice that these triggers have little cavities in them for a spring to be placed. And here at Frontline Foam, we don't really see the need to put those springs in that spot because the triggers return to their position either way. So we're not too worried about it, and we actually leave the springs out. However, if you want to get some springs and put them in those grooves, that's totally up to you. It'll make the triggers a little bit stiffer maybe, but for our purposes, it works, so we're going to move on. We are going to get started with soldering. A little bit of a heads up. I am not a professional electrician or anything like that. My only experience with soldering is basically in Nerf blasters. And my goal is always just to make it work and make it durable. So if you have a lot of experience with soldering, some of the things I may do may seem strange or whatever. And I just recommend that you use your own expertise that you may have over mine. If you don't know how to solder, I highly recommend that you go find a YouTube video or something of the sort to kind of read up or learn a bit about soldering and the basics. I'm not going to go over a lot of it here. I'm just going to show you how I arrange the wiring in this blaster. So to get started, I'm going to get my wire ready. I just grabbed some wire segments here. Your hardware kit will have the proper wire amount that you need for your blaster. This is just what I grabbed. So I might do some splicing here and there. I'm going to strip and twist the beginning of this wire. And I am going to take one of my switches and I'm going to clamp it down. So I've got this first switch clamped down now, and I have my wire that I stripped and twisted just now. I'm going to tin that real quick. And this wire is going to feed along. It's going to be a really tight fit in the handle, so I'm trying to manage the wires as best as I can, and I hope you guys can follow along. But this wire is actually going to need to feed right below this piece and then attach to this piece here. So we're going to solder that to that and tuck the wire. We're going to solder it at an angle such that we can tuck it later. So let's do that. Okay, so we have the wire nice and attached, nice and sturdy, and it is at an angle in which we can tuck it below the switch here. So with that, let's move on. Now what we're going to do is we are going to place this in the handle to judge where we're going to make our next cut to solder with. So this switch is going to sit at the bottom here, and as you can see, there are some holes in the handle that line up with the holes in the switch. You may notice, and we are working on correcting this, but the top hole is lined up there, but the bottom hole is just barely not lined up. For the time being, I'm going to just be putting a screw in the top. You'll see that more later, but we will work on the alignment of these holes later, and that file set will be available. So what I'm going to do is I have this switch here. I'm holding it in reference to this hole, making sure that I can see light through that. And then I'm going to take this switch and place it in here and also line it up with its holes. And it doesn't have to be perfect, but I'm kind of holding things in place. And now this red wire is going to connect with that port there on the switch. So we need to make a cut, and not actually a cut, we need to strip the wire at that point. So I've got everything in place, and I've got my thumb over the point that I want to strip at. I'm going to pull that out, and watch what I do here. I make a pinch there and a pinch there. Trying to show you guys, I'm really bad at keeping things in frame. So we've got the two cuts, and now I'm just going to use my fingernail and peel back the gap in between. Boom, give it a bit of a twist, and there we have a part where or a place in which we can make a junction. And now if we put everything back, we can check to see that it does in fact line up properly with that piece. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to get everything held down for me. As you can see, I just tightened both of these down in my overkill vise here, and I'm going to now solder this piece to this piece. Something to keep in mind is that just like how this wire feeds underneath this piece, this wire also needs to stay underneath. It doesn't need to, but for this part that we're using, we want to make the wiring as compact as possible. So that's why I'm trying to keep it as flush as I can here. So I'm going to actually solder it just like so, if you can see that reasonably. So let's do that. All right, so we just got that attached. And as you can see, it's literally soldered onto the side of the prong there. So that way it's nice and flat and it can just tuck underneath. That's the goal. If you are using the updated handle that has a larger groove in the back for passage of wire, then you don't really need to worry about doing this too much. You should have the room to just throw it right on top. Also, another thing, I'm not putting a lot of heat shrink on these switches just because these switches don't move anywhere and there's no risk of any shortage. But you can put heat shrink on these parts if you want. So we've got this going, which is great. I'm going to buckle this bottom switch down now, and I'm going to take another section. I'm going to use red. It probably will help if you guys follow along the colors as best as you can. Going to give that a twist, and this is going to connect here. No, nothing special about it. Just throw it right on top. Okay, so we've got that guy connected. I'm going to undo this one, and this switch, we're done with this switch for now. I'm going to move that out of the way and then buckle down this other switch. And now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go grab another red wire, and that red wire segment is going to attach here and point backwards. This time, however, like the one earlier, it's gonna attach and get out of the way this direction. Instead of this way, it's gonna be this way. I hope you can see that. So let's go do that. There we go. This wire's connected, and notice how it goes around the other side of the prong without much contest. So looking good. This is what we want. We have 2 switches, and in the end we have 3 wires coming out of it. So I'm just gonna hold this up to the camera, and you can take a still, or you can pause the video is what I mean, and you can just kind of have a look at this and do your best to replicate it. Okay guys, something I just did here is I actually marked each of these wires, and I'll show you what I did. This is really great for just not mixing anything up later. So I took this silver Sharpie, and what I did is I pulled this wire, okay? This one's gonna go to the battery, it's gonna go to the back. So I put 3 dots on it, and I'll explain why this all makes sense later. This one that comes out of the top switch in the bottom prong, not the elbow, I put 2 dots on it. And then this last one that connects the 2 switches, I put 1 dot on it. Now, the way this is gonna work is when these switches are sat in the handle, right? 1 wire is gonna point out to the left, 1 wire is gonna point out to the right, and the last wire is gonna point to the back, to the battery. So it's 1, 2, 3, if that makes sense. Actually, no, correction, 2 and 1. So 1, 2, 3, and you'll watch me do this. So hopefully you don't get lost in any part of it. But yeah, this one will feed to the motors. This one will feed to the pusher. So 1, 2, and then this one is going to feed all the way back to the battery. I hope that made sense. If not, I just kind of look silly here putting dots on wires. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take the 3 wires up top, and I'm gonna grab the handle here and feed all 3 through this hole in the top of the handle and gently pull them through. And I'm going to arrange the switches back to their spots. This can be a little tough, and we don't want to pinch any wires because we actually risk cutting them and causing a short. But I'm just going to tuck everything the best I can into their spots. Okay, that was a bit of a fight, as you may have seen. That's one of the reasons we are working on that little optimization, just because there's so little room for these wires. Or maybe I'm doing something wrong, I don't know. But I can see light through this hole, so I know that this switch is where it needs to be, and I can see light through this hole, so I know where this switch needs to be, or is where it needs to be. And most importantly, all the wires are mostly tucked into this groove. If they stick out a little bit at the top, that's okay. The next piece that goes in there will actually give some room for those, but as of now, we're looking good for this part. Okay, so we've got these in place. Now, as you can see, we have this F-shaped part. This part is going to fit over here, and it has this cut in it, and that's what gives those wires the extra space. So I'm going to tuck the switches back in here, or not the switches, the triggers. Tuck them back in their positions. There we go. And now I'm going to take some screws and put them in either top hole of the switches to secure the switches to the handle. Now I'm going to do something different because we are out of these screws currently, but we'll be sending you guys 4 12mm shell screws. These are 10, so they're not long enough to do the job. but you'll have 4 12 millimeters of these. So make sure you separate them from the rest because they're actually specifically for these 4 holes. I'm going to be using a bigger screw, and I'm only going to be doing these top 2 holes just because there are some corrections that need to be done on this handle. But I'm going to go ahead and secure these switches down, and you can do the same with your 4 screws. All right, I've got my switches bolted down. Once again, I'm doing these with different screws because I don't have the right ones currently, but that's okay. You'll have your 4 12 millimeter screws to do this. As soon as you have those switches in, double check that your triggers are still engaging those buttons properly, and most importantly, that they're returning to the off position. With that, we are going to slide this piece on, and it just presses right into place there. And as you can see, my triggers, as I test them, they're getting jammed. And that's okay. Really what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to give the triggers a little bit extra room by just filing off the edge of this piece here. All right, so after a little bit of touching up, the triggers both click and return to their positions, which is great. It's kind of just the nature of 3D printed parts. They fit together on the computer in the CAD software, but then when you print them, they don't. But that's okay. It happens. Even if your triggers are just barely ever so tight, or every once in a while they don't return to their position, chances are you'll actually be okay, because later when you have things plugged in, the vibration that goes throughout the whole blast will actually loosen everything up and things will work a lot smoother than they did without the battery. I wouldn't rely on that per se, but just something to keep in mind. So that actually, we're not going to bolt down just yet. We're just going to kind of leave it there. Now what we're going to do is we're going to attach this piece here. There we go. And notice how it just slides into the groove there. We'll put a screw there in a second. And this piece is going to go here, but we need to feed the wires through the piece. So remember, it goes 1, 2, 3, left, right, back. We're going to do the 1 dot is going to actually just come out the left, so we don't need to worry about that one because we have the opening. The 2 dot is going to go out the right. And the 3 dot is going to go out the back. And I'm just going to slowly pull things into place. This 3 dot also needs to feed all the way back because the battery is going to be back here. All the way out the back. And there we go. Looking good. We now are going to need a long black wire that's going to feed straight through all of this and out the left hole here. I don't have a wire long enough, so I'm just gonna splice these two together real quick. All right, so we've got our much longer segment of wire. I'm gonna feed it through the back. And I'm watching it come out through here. Good. And exactly that, I want it to come out the left side. Now, as for the length of wire coming out the back here, I'll show you guys what we're looking for. This is kind of the butt of the blaster. If we have wires feeding through it, we want to be able to the plug is going to go right here. We want to be able to pull the plug out and be able to plug in our battery easily. So it's always nice to have at least like 1 inch coming out of the housing. So I'm actually not going to extend this. I think this is the perfect length. And this one I'm going to cut later. So just, yeah, as you're soldering yours, make sure that you have, it looks like this is about, I don't know, 3 inches, 2.5 coming out the back, but you can always cut it to your taste. So we have these two wires sticking out the left, and that is our number 1. And then we have the number 2 sticking out the right, and the 3 coming out the back. So we're on a roll. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm going to put a screw here, here, and here to secure these two pieces together. Okay, so we've got those 3 screws in. There is a hole here that connects these two parts. I find it really hard to get an angle on a screw in that position, so sometimes we just kind of skip it, and that's okay because it's still going to be plenty sturdy after. However, a screw that I don't like to skip is this one here. There's a screw that feeds through this and into this one. Sometimes it's tough to get them lined up, and if you notice, I can kind of pull these two parts to make them shift. You can do that to help you line up the screw properly. Okay, there we go. All these pieces are together and actually pretty sturdy, so looking good. That's where we should be at. Now we're gonna move on to the cage. So for assembling the cage, what we're gonna start out with is we are going to look down into these grooves where our motors are gonna go. You can see that there's kind of some leftover filament from the print, and that's okay, to be expected. We could probably throw the motors in there just fine, but I'm going to take a file and actually tidy up the inside of these grooves quickly, just to get any obvious and problematic pieces of filament out of the way. Something else I like to do is I like to take this little guy and actually just poke out these holes, just to make sure that they're nice and clear so the screws have no obstruction to connect to those wheels later, or to the motors. Now, we're going to use these motors right here. Foam Blast, Fang Revamp. We're going to throw these. The orientation actually doesn't matter, but for the sake of you guys being able to follow along, I'm going to put the Foam Blast part, come on, reflection, pointing outwards. The Foam Blast parts are going to both point away from each other. It's really important that these red dots are not on the same line, that they alternate. So now that we've got the motors in their spot, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of cheat and use these Mark 8 Pigeon tab protectors, you could call them. They're used for honey badger motors, but they work just fine on these, obviously. These tabs that stick out are quite delicate. You want to make sure that you're not like pushing down on it. So I use these to protect those tabs, so that way any downward force is transferred to the back plate of the motor instead of those tabs. So it's kind of awkward, but this will do the trick. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to use just a dot of thread lock. This is optional, although I recommend it. It just helps the screws stay in there. I'm going to use a dot of thread lock on each of these 4 holes and then put in these 4 itty bitty motor screws. You'll see me use a drill to do this. I, however, don't recommend that you use a drill. I recommend that you do this by hand because it's easy to strip these motors. I'm just very used to this drill and I know exactly how it performs, so I'm just going to do it for time-saving sake. So here we are. We've got each of the 4 motor screws in their spots, and they're nice and tight. The tightness that you're going to go for on these is nice and hand tight. They're going to get snug, and then they'll kind of stop, and you really just leave it there. If you have a little screwdriver, you shouldn't be able to over-tighten them, but yeah, just be careful and really pay attention to how they feel as they go in. If you are building a dual-stage Bulwark, you'll have 2 more motors up here, and you're just going to replicate these exact same motor positions up there. So the red and the red dots will alternate, the Foam Blast will point out, and you'll just put them up here. So we'll roll with that. Now we're going to take these worker flywheels, and these very easily just slip onto the top here, and we press them straight down. It's actually kind of hard to press these too far, so you can just kind of push down as much as you want, and as long as they still spin, they'll kind of they'll lock because they're quite magnetic motors. But as long as they spin without too much friction that's not from the motor, then you're good to go. I'll throw the other wheel over here. There we go. So we've got both wheels here, and if I look straight down where the darts are going to be feeding, I can tell that the wheels are level with each other. One isn't higher than the other. That's what we don't want. It'll make the blaster shoot crooked or not at all later. If you want to judge the distance a little better, you can look at kind of how much shaft is sticking out the top of these wheels. That helps too. But either way, just push them all the way on and you're good to go. Piece of cake. While we're here, I'm going to quickly tin each of these 4 tabs with the soldering iron. So we've got a little bit of solder on each tab. We have that ready for the future. Now what we're going to do is we're going to prepare these 2 wires that are going to connect to these motors up here. Now, to judge the distance for where I want to start messing with these wires, what I do is I slip the cage onto this spot here. The cage, when we assemble it later, the cage is going to fit exactly right here. This is going to be flush, and you're going to see a shape roughly like this out the front. And it kind of sits there, which is nice. So without having to build the whole thing, we know where the cage is going to be. And because we know where the cage is going to be, I can trace these wires up here and judge the distance that I need to start slitting them at, or stripping them at. So I'm going to double check to make sure I have the correct wire. It's the 1 dot, and then I have the black wire that runs back to the battery. And I'm going to pull these out the front. What's going to happen is they're going to feed through the outer part of the shell here at about an angle like this. So kind of just pinch it here and then pull it forward to the motors, and you can judge the distance there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my marker and I'm going to mark the red one at the first tab and the black one at the second tab, just like that. Now, it's a little rough, obviously, give or take. It's okay if you have a little bit of slack in the wire. In fact, it's better that way. But we've got the beginning of where we need to make our splices or our trims to the wire. You get what I mean. I'm losing my words today. So now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold this wire here and here up against these tabs where they're going to connect. And then I'm going to mark where I'm going to strip the wire here. So now I have 2 markings for where I'm going to remove the coating and attach it. And the same goes for the black. I'm going to hold it here and mark it. And now I have those 2 spots. Something to keep in mind is when you're marking this back wire, the red one, do be careful to add a little bit of slack. As you can see, if we go straight across, it actually bridges this gap here. There's going to be a moving part later that spins in this direction, and if our wire is in the way, it'll impede that part from moving. So I recommend that you provide a little bit of slack in the wire bending in this direction, so that way the pusher wheel has room to rotate freely. So give it a little bit of a bend with your markings. Keep that in mind. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to strip these wires at those 4 spots, and I'm going to cut the ends as well and solder them on. Oh, and one more thing. The black wire, the wire coming from the battery, we actually don't want to cut it here. We just want to strip it here and let the wire continue, because that's going to feed to our pusher motor later. So here we have it. We have our connections all set up. Now, for those of you who are assembling a dual stage, the way the wiring is going to work from here is, imagine this red wire continues. Both wires are going to loop around and connect to the 4 tabs up front, like so. Just like the first 2 motors, it's going to be red, then black, and in the front 2, it's also going to be red and black. So just kind of loop your wires around. This is a very pathetic way to demonstrate it, honestly, but I hope you get the idea that the dual stage motors, you're just going to need to flip a UE here and come up to the next pair of motors and connect to those. But the same principles apply for the back ones. It's going to be black wire in front, red wire in the back. And make sure your dots match, or rather that they don't match on either side. So it's red up top, red low, red up top, red low, if that makes sense. What we're going to do now is we're going to start throwing together the front half. We're going to take our little motor here, the pusher spinner motor thingy. This one is a 600 RPM motor. There's all sorts of different types that you can order, going faster and slower than this one. But what we're going to do is we're going to take this pusher wheel and we're going to push this guy straight in to that hole. And you may notice that the hole is actually not perfectly circular, and as you can see, this shaft is also not perfectly round. So you're going to match the flat edge of the shaft with the flat edge of the hole. Now this can be a pretty tight fit, at least on our printers it comes out as a pretty tight fit, and we want it to be pretty decently snug. We don't want this to slide around later. I am going to use my overkill vise here to gently and carefully press the motor into its spot. I know that it's lined up already and I even got it started, so now I'm just going to carefully continue. Alright, so we just pressed the motor into the print, and we see that it spins freely. You want to get the motor as deep as you can without touching the inside of that print, so you can still spin it. But do remember just to overall be pretty careful with these little motors. Now, what's going to happen is this motor is going to feed into that spot right there, just like that, click. And just so you guys can follow along so the wiring's easier for you later, I have the positive side on top. Let's keep that in mind. Also, something cool is this pusher motor, there's a double variant of it where it has another hook up here that essentially doubles your rounds per minute. It's a cool little upgrade that you can do. And the distance that I'm judging here for the depth of the motor, you notice that the motor can shift, right? I'm going to put this other half of the part on, and I want that motor, the spinner, to sit in the middle of the 2 prints. I don't want it to be protruding too far to either side. I want it to have freedom of movement. So, looking good. What we're going to do now is we're going to take a shell screw and drop it down this hole right here, and tighten that down gently until we feel that it snugs up against the side of the motor. This will keep the motor in its current position. As you tighten it down, keep a finger on the motor so you can feel if the motor moves while you're doing it, because sometimes when the screw comes in contact, it'll actually make it shift. So yeah, I got cheated a little bit and mine shifted over. So that's way too far to the right. Gonna need to back it out and scoot it back over. There we are, we're in the middle. Just double check that that's tightened. And there we go. So, with that, we are going to grab these 2 side plates. I don't know what they're called. I'm going to call them side plates. And these slip on like so. Notice that the flat surface is here and the kind of curved surface is on the outside. So it's going to sit like that, and we're going to throw a shell screw right here to connect it. And we're going to do the same for the other side. Remember, it's flat over here and curved over here, flat over here and whatever over here. So for reference, this in my right hand is the right side, and this in my left hand is the left side. So I'm going to put the right side underneath here, and I'm going to take my wire with 2 dots and poke it through here, that hole. And then I'm going to gently pull the wire as I slide this part into position. And it's going to sit like that. I'm going to leave it loose for now, though. Now, this is a bit tricky, but I mean, I guess we could have done this in a different order, but I like to bolt this down ahead of time, and then I can just gently pull on the print to get a big enough gap to pull the wires through into their spot. There we go. Almost. There we go. So now the 2 motor wires are fed through that side. And I'm going to pull the cage this direction. Pull on that black wire just to get the slack out. So now everything's pretty floppy, and it's going to start being a bit hard to hold all in one piece, but that's okay. What I'm doing now is I'm gently sliding this cage into its groove up here. There you go, it's all lined up. And as soon as it's in there, I can push it back into its position. But there's a lot of things we need to do here. Firstly, I forgot, but we need to put these 7 rollers onto these pegs here. You'll notice that the rollers have the top edge of the print. I'm so sorry about the frame, guys. And the bottom edge of the print. I like to alternate, so that way there's no risk of the thicker ends causing more friction than necessary, but that's just me being overkill. There we go. And now we place this guy and carefully jumble it into place so that way the pegs on this line up with the pegs in there. Looking good. Now what we're going to do is we're just going to start throwing screws everywhere. We're going to do screws here, through all these holes, and on the other side. However, remember that these holes only have 1 screw on either side. They don't have 1 on both. It just is either the left or the right. It doesn't matter. So let's start bolting it together. Okay, so we got all the bolts on this side. Now I'm going to flip it over and do the other side while holding it together. Okay, we got all the bolts over here taken care of. I did drop one earlier, and this is something to keep in mind for you guys. Keep track of your nuts and bolts, because if you drop one, it could end up in the cage, and they could actually get stuck and cause the motors to fry when we turn it on. So before you put this in, just make sure that the wheels are spinning, that there aren't any screws that snuck in there and got stuck to the motors because of the magnets. So now that we're here, what I like to do is come to the back and get these wires up here prepped for a battery, because I want to test the motors and make sure that things are spinning the right direction, that nothing went wrong. So I'm going to gently feed the cage into its position. About this amount of slack is just what we want on the wires. So we're pointed out the back here. We already tested the length of this one. It's long enough, about 2.5, 3 inches. I'm going to cut the black one to be the same length. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to strip and tin these two wires and get a battery to test the motors. All right, so we've got our battery, we tinned these two wires, and I'm going to pop the cage out and let it sit up here gently, because I want to be able to watch those motors and make sure that they're spinning the right direction. I'm going to gently put the red one here and the black one here and kind of hold it at a bend so that way it stays. And I'm going to press this bottom button and the motors should rev. Okay, wonderful. That's a good sign. I'm gently touching the wheels because I'm trying to feel and not only see but also feel which way they're spinning. Right now they're not spinning the correct direction. You want the darts to go that way, not this way. So that means that when I solder this to a connector, I want red to be negative and black to be positive. Now, like I said, I'm no electrician. I usually just end up building these, and whichever polarity they need at the end, I do accordingly. So bear with me on that. So we're going to throw the red on negative. I am going to put heat shrink here, though. And yeah, so red's going to be negative and black is going to be positive. So we threw on the connector just like this. Some nice heat shrink, keep it nice and cozy. I'm going to plug back into the motor once again just to be extra sure that things are spinning. And that's what we want, looking good. So to put the cage in, we're just going to do it like we did before. Just slip it over the front just like that. Now, as for attaching this muzzle piece, it can actually be pretty tricky. Mine is not a super great fit, as you can see. We're going to grab a shell screw, drop the shell screw into this hole. So I'm actually going to put the cage in first, then the muzzle piece. If you want, if yours is fitting nicely, you can take the cage out, put the muzzle piece on with the one screw through the top, and then slide it in. But I'm going to do it this way, just because it's a pretty snug fit. Boom. And to get that screw on top, I'm going to loosen these two screws up here. So that way I can gently split this top half. There we go. And I'm going to slip the driver between so that way I can get that screw tightened down. So now we're gonna flip it over and we're almost there. We're almost done with the soldering, and then it gets super easy. So we've got everything here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hold this black wire here, give it a little bit of slack, and I'm gonna cut it here so that way it can reach the tabs on that little motor. Boom. And same with the red one, I'm gonna give it a little bit of slack and then pinch it here, and that's where I'm gonna snip it. Now we just strip these and we're gonna tin all four surfaces and throw it all together. Okay, so I just finished soldering all this together. I put the red wire on top and the black wire on the bottom. Remember, my positive symbol is on top, so red being positive up here. And I checked to see that the spinner was spinning in the right direction. It should spin like this. Now, if you followed my wiring exactly, then you should be done with the wiring now. Another thing, be super careful when you're soldering onto this little motor. It's quite heat sensitive, and if you apply too much heat to those tabs, they can actually melt and fall straight in. So just be super gentle and be very quick in your soldering there. So the soldering is all done, all the electrical stuff, we're finished. Now it's just time to start bolting it together. Okay, let's start throwing some parts on. you're going to take this right-handed piece. It's going to go on the right side. Notice that it's got the edge like this, and it's got the 4 holes here, and this one does not. So the one with the 4 holes, we're going to take it. We're going to take these 3 little black pieces. This is going to be the mag release. So we're going to take this guy, and we are going to put in a shell screw in each of these back 2 holes. Those serve as strengtheners for these pegs, so that way the print doesn't break. So 2 screws here. There we go. Make sure they're not sticking out. We've got 2 screws in there. Now, we're going to slide this piece onto this peg, and I can already tell it's a really tight fit. I don't want it to be that tight. So before I even slide it on anymore, I am going to take a little file, and I'm just going to gently widen that hole ever so slightly. There we go. I was able to slide it all the way on. It did kind of click. And it does have a fair bit of resistance here, but that's actually okay. It might serve, it does kind of serve to help us later. Now, I'm going to do the same for this one. I'm going to test the fit, file it if I need to. This one up top, we do want to be a looser fit for sure. There we go, we've got it on. It's a decently loose fit. It doesn't need to be gliding or anything, but it should be loose. Should be easy to move around. Now what we need to do is we need to get this spring into that groove there and that one there. Hopefully you saw that, or hopefully you can see it on your own print. The way I like to do this, and it usually never works the first time, so I'm gonna look like a doofus here. Is tuck it into the top one here while it's halfway on, and then tuck it into this piece here. And then as I slide it on, I slide the spring with it. There we go. And then I just give a spring a nudge so it jumps into its hole. Click, boom. And that's exactly what we want. We want it to be spring loaded, just like that. Perfect. Now I'm going to tilt this one back. And as you can see, when I tilt this back, it reveals 2 more holes. Those 2 holes are going to use a shell screw and connect into these 2 holes here on the print. So it's going to smack on just like that. So let's do that. There we go. That's working correctly. You can put a spring down here if you want, but it'll work either way. In fact, it works without any springs. We just like to put one on top, and then the bottom one still serves its purpose just fine. Now this piece is going to sit on the right side here, and we're going to connect it through these 2 holes here. Just like the right side, we're going to now put on this panel 2 screws here and here. Now we're going to take the butt. We're going to feed the wire through this here, and it's going to stick out the bottom. And then it's just going to slide right onto this square piece. Boom, just like that. And we're going to secure it with 2 screws on this side and 2 screws on this side. Now we're going to take these motor side panels, and you can quite easily tell how they fit. Just going to snap it into place, and do be careful as you put these on. You can see where the wire is supposed to go. As you put it on, just make sure you're not pinching the wire anywhere, and help it into its groove if you need to. Make sure it's sitting at least close to flat. If it's not, there's probably a wire in the way. So I'm just going to tuck that out of the way, boom. And this is going to be secured with 3 screws. Make sure the screw you use in this top part right here isn't too long. If it is too long, it might actually poke through in here and impede the magazine entry. So keep that in mind. These default screws, if I remember right, aren't a problem. So just 3 screws. While we're here, you'll notice that these two holes on the cage don't have screws in them yet. Forgot to do that. That's totally fine. Just throw 2 screws in here, and I'm going to do the whole thing for the other side as well. All right, we're really getting warmer now. We've got all this going. Now we're just gonna slap on the rest of these parts. I'm gonna do this really quick. This front handguard just sits like so. This angle points upwards. It is not like this, it's like this. These 2 side panel grips obviously are gonna screw into each of these 2 holes, just like that. Same with the other side. The battery cover is going to use this thumb screw. The thumb screw is going to feed through here and then into the nut embedded in the print here. And these side panels, this one's going to be on the right and this one's on the left. Custom text, by the way, you can totally do that. And those are just going to be 4 screws there and there. And lastly, this cheek guard is going to sit here with 4 screws. Pretty self-explanatory, kind of getting into Lego territory here, so let's just throw it together. And here we are, the Bulwark. Looking good. Really like the colors here. Yeah, the Bulwark. We got it all thrown together. We got all the screws in. I'm gonna go prep a mag and throw a battery in. I'll show you guys how to do that. It's pretty easy. And we'll dump a mag and see how it goes. So to put the battery in, we're just gonna undo this thumb screw here. And there's our cord. Good thing we judged that distance right. It's nice and easy to access. And we have our battery. This fits all sorts of sizes. I bet you could. It does fit a 1.5. I know that. I don't know if it could go any bigger, but just gonna tuck the battery in there. Just tuck the wires gently. Really nothing crazy about it. I really like a blaster that makes room for its battery. And then just hand tighten that back down. The battery's in there nice and secure. That's what we want to see. This shouldn't do anything. That should rev the motors. And when we pull both, we see both moving. So, this is the cool part, ready? Boom. The Bulwark. All right, let's see. Looking good. There you have it. So, like I said at the beginning, something that I wanted to do is talk about the Bulwark and some things that I personally recommend for it. First off, this is a single stage. Single stage is just fine. Single stage will do work. Single stage will have the same rate of fire, and it'll still shoot darts pretty hard. I don't know the FPSs off the top of my head, but if you get a dual stage, you essentially boost your FPS greatly. And most importantly, during sustained automatic fire, you maintain that FPS. So that's important. But like I said, dual stage works just fine. And yeah, you can get custom text of your own. You got frontline foam on this side, and you can put your name on it, some catchphrase or something intimidating. It's up to you. But yeah, the Bulwark, a great blaster, really cool, really unique. Highly recommend it if you're looking for something full auto and compact and quite stylish. Another customization that you can choose on our website is what kind of pusher motor you want to use. You can get a 600 RPM, a 1200 RPM, of course. Those are rotations per minute, and those equate to essentially how many darts you're firing per second. So that's something to keep in mind as well as for what you want to upgrade there. Thanks for watching, guys. I really hope this helped.